So this is an interesting episode to talk about because my phone just went off. I'm leaving that in. I'm leaving that in the edit. That's great. This is an interesting episode to talk about because of the fact that my phone went off and the fact that it's simultaneously a good example of a good episode and a bad episode all in one. Originally, this was actually supposed to be a two-parter, and in many ways that kind of shows. The narrative feels a little squished and a little rushed, and they rely a lot on musical cues and visual cues in order to try and push certain angles, which I'll talk about more later, rather than actually having dialogue or whatnot. Now, you might think, well, that sounds like a good thing. It kind of is, and it kind of isn't. Now, the other weird thing to talk about in this episode is the VOD War themselves. I have nowhere to put this. I have this giant new notebook. It's huge, and I don't have anywhere to put it on my desk. So I'll just hold on to it. Here, I'll drop it on the floor. There we go. The VOD War were originally intended to be the new big villains. They'd already done the Hirogen, they were intending to do something with the Voth, they were intending to do something with the Malon, and that was part of the plan, if you recall. Have a major villain show up, have them be a villain for several episodes, have them go away, in order to keep getting across that idea of the fact that Voyager was continuing home. That was part of the point, and I agreed with that point. However, if you're paying attention, the Voth were a villain for one episode, despite being surprisingly well fleshed out as a species, and the Vodwar were an enemy for one episode, this one. And the unfortunate thing is that basically makes them feel like bad guys of the week. It removes a lot of the significance, at least for someone like me, to look at someone and say, well, that's cool, and I'll never see them again. This is kind of the similarity between the whole lack of character continuity thing that I've talked about many, many times in Voyager, and one of the reasons why it bothers me so much. It's like, oh, okay, that's great, and then you're gone. Okay, whatever. Now I have a note here on my notes. You're going to make fun of you before. So the teaser's playing, and they're like, oh my god, we're under attack. Quick, we need to get into the stasis cells. I swear I wouldn't even be bringing this up if it wasn't the first thing that jumped out at me. Why is she wearing heels? Like, it was the first thing I noticed, because the camera's right there at the foot level, so you could see them nice and clear, and I'm just like... I'm not asking in-universe. There's plenty of explanations for why in-universe she might be wearing heels. Why did they put that actress in heels? Moving on. I kind of want to talk about this point last. So let's talk about this point last. Again, let's talk about something that Voyager's had a problem for a long time. I've actually been talking about this since the Kazon were the big villains of the week, and for some reason kept being the big villains of the week, despite the fact that they were the Kazon. The writers on Voyager seem to not know how to write combat. Now, I've talked about this before, so I'm only going to briefly rehash my point. If you were a writer and you don't know how to write tactics or combat or art or science or whatever, some concept that your characters or your setting would be aware of and would know how to do, but you, the writer, don't, you get an expert. That's why those people exist. There's an entire industry of people who serve as creative consultants for, insert concept here. So that you can hire someone and say, hey, look, I need a big action scene here. I need to science my way out of this situation from point A to point B. I need to really discuss these finer points of music or cooking or whatever. Something that the writer themselves just doesn't know. So they bring in the expert and they toss a few creative consultant bucks at them. They're like Monopoly bucks, but they're bigger. And they're really well drawn. And you toss them at them and they're like, aha, well, why don't you do this? But Voyager doesn't do that. I've actually discussed in the past the difference between Voyager's combat scenes and TNG's combat scenes. And I'll be discussing this more when we actually get to TNG, probably next year, beginning of next year. Rough approximation. But every single ounce of the combat, and there's actually a lot of combat in this episode, relatively speaking, was just oozing with that problem. There's no great sense of actual danger, and Voyager itself puts in the most pathetic performance. I actually sat and counted. I hate to point that out, but I hate to really, really geek in on this. But so, Voyager's there, and they've found these aliens, and the aliens are like, we'll help you. And Voyager's like, great, we're going to leave. And the aliens are like, no, we're going to board you. And the Voyager's like, no, we're not going to allow that. And the aliens are like, okay. They shoot them. And then they shoot them a second time. The second shot disables their warp engines. The second shot disables their warp engines. Their shields are still up, by the way. In fact, at the third shot, their shields went down to 82%. Yes, I actually wrote this crap down. Like I said, I actually decided to do it. It took... And I actually did the math, just for the hell of it. Each shot was doing, roughly, 1/12 of the amount of damage that Voyager shields could take. Every single shot. Now, that may or may not sound like significant, but try to think of it this way, okay? Shields down. That wasn't really long, was it? Those were individual shots, by the way, ignoring the fact that by the time the battle was concluding, they had multiple ships there. I forget it was 3 or 4. How long does it take 3? We'll be generous. How long does it take 3 ships to do 12 shots? Oh, we're there. And yet, despite the fact that everything they're presenting to us is the fact that Voyager is getting completely wrecked by an enemy that is so superior to them that it makes the Borg look weak by comparison. Makes the Borg look trivial by comparison. Voyager still has no problem outmaneuvering them and going into a very dangerous area that they can only survive because they have better shields than the other guys do. Please think about this for a moment. I've said it before and I've said it again. I know it's hard to generate a threat for people who are as advanced as the people on Star Trek are. That is a genuine problem. Here's a thought. The one ship starts hitting them and they just shrug it off. It's like, okay, whatever. We'll just go to warp. Well, we can't. Well, why not? Well, because we're inches from that stupid corridor again. We go to warp again, we're going to get sucked right back into it just like we were last time. And we're not sure we can get out of that. Okay, let's think of another way. Now the reinforcements show up. Now 3 ships are hitting them. Okay, this is starting to hurt a little bit. Maybe we should start thinking a way out of this. Maybe we should consider that plan. Well, and then that's when someone says, oh, Captain, there's a planet over there we can go hide on. Since our shields are still fine, okay, we'll go hide there. And then later they stay hidden there and the whole VOD War thing happens because by the time they've been down there for a little bit, they're up to 13 ships, which would actually be a threat. A natural progression that doesn't involve Voyager just randomly getting... warp engines are offline in 2 hits. I don't know what else to say about that. There's one other problem with it, though. The shots are patterned with the dialogue. I know most of you probably are not rewatching these episodes with me, unlike the Babylon 5 videos I do on Mondays. But I want you, if you have the availability, to rewatch this episode. It's right at the beginning. You know, it's the teaser, and then, 5 minutes after that is this combat scene I'm ragging on, okay? Watch the scene. Watch the dialogue. Note when the shots happen. The shots are literally cadenced as if they were an aspect of the dialogue. As if there was someone listening to them talking and that at every appropriate point would fire another shot. It's really especially apparent at one particular point at which... I forget who exactly. I want to say Chakotay. Someone has something to say for a bit. You know, they're like, blah, 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 blah. It's like 20 or 25 seconds of solid dialogue. No shots happen for that 20, 25 seconds for no reason. And then the moment he's done talking, I think it was Chakotay, the moment they're done talking, another shot. I point this out because this is part of why I say this episode is a weird one to talk about. If you really pay attention to this episode, and the 2 points I'll be talking about last as well, tie into this as well, the whole episode is actually kind of dumb. It is kind of badly written. There's some good character stuff. Credit Joe Menosky as usual. He knows what he's doing. And credit to Brennan Braga for coming up with a cool idea. I'll talk about the idea thing later. the underspace specifically. But you can feel their fingerprints on this episode because it's definitely one of those events happen because they are in service of the plot, which, if you remember, is literally what Joe Menosky thinks. Like, that's he's not shy about that. He thinks, we need to get to the plot, so screw how we get there. I remember I discussed this when it came to the Leonardo da Vinci episode. You could just come up with some random technobabble and boom, there you go. And the other writers were the ones like, no, we have to come up with some explanation for this. And he's like, why? Just get to the good stuff. Joe Menosky is good at character stuff, but his fingerprints are everywhere on this, because it's basically like, we need to get Voyager down to this planet. Okay, corridor, and then down, we're attacked by 3 people who destroy us, and then down to the planet. I'm done. So then Seven randomly wakes up the VOD War, and the only reason she gives for doing this is, oh, I figured he could help. Maybe I'm just a hardened, bitter, cynical, young idiot. I don't know. But, no. You don't just... I can't even picture just randomly walking up to a stasis bed and being like, oh, let's just wake this person up. Now, in the interest of fairness, we have seen that happen before in Star Trek. Colin! Oh, excuse me. But it's just weird, especially from Seven. And of course, it's another one of those it happened in service of the plot moments. It also happens in service of a Seven thing, which I'll go ahead and talk about now, because why not? Seven learns a lesson about humanity in this episode, guys. Isn't that great? How she learns about the explorative spirit and the desire to make up for all her misdeeds and blah, blah, blah. She has 3 scenes. The initial one, the one where she's talking to Gedrin, and the one and the coda. And all of them are about the, Seven learns a lesson about humanity thing, which has been kind of a recurring thing. I'm not going to be too harsh on it, though, because I know what episode's coming next week. Just remember that, guys. Promise me you're going to remember this point for next week. It is interesting to me that the VOD War gentleman, Gedrin, I think I'm pronouncing his name right, recognizes her as a Borg immediately. That could be seen as either good or bad writing. I think it's actually good writing, though. It would make sense to me that the Borg would be less cybernetic, more biological 900 years ago. That's a fairly large chunk of time. And as he mentioned, the Borg were not nearly so threatening back then, which also makes sense. And as mentioned, the VOD War actually managed to survive encounters with the Borg, which also makes sense given the other things. So that whole thing makes sense, and I thought it was just interesting. I found myself wondering, though, what the Borg were really like 900 years ago. I really wonder if anybody... I have this theory that I have nothing really to substantiate it other than everything I just told you about. And everything in this episode and everything, period. But I really wonder if the Borg could have been nipped in the bud back in the day, back when they first really started going, when they first started becoming the Borg. Back before they had access to all the technology they have assimilated as of the now, where they are, well, let's not put too nice of a point out, they are the juggernauts of the Star Trek setting. And I wonder if they were allowed to get to that point. If the politics and the military powers and all the races back then looked at the Borg and said, either not our problem or beneath us. Because remember, the Borg grow by assimilating other technologies, right? That's how they advance, that's how they adapt. Imagine how much weaker they would have been compared to the powers back then, I wouldn't even be surprised if they couldn't seriously threaten most of the major powers of the Quadrant 900 years ago. I could easily see, just picture it. It's so crystal clear. Picture the committee where they have to discuss the Borg issue. What have we lost to the Borg, Senator? Oh, well, or, speaker or representative, whatever term you want to use. Oh, well, we lost a few ships in the outer perimeter to the Borg. Our military were able to repel the rest. The Borg immediately retreated. Do we really need to waste resources on these Borg? I mean, are they really much of a threat? We have so many other internal conflicts that we should be focusing our attention on, and what about our territorial disputes with insert species here? Wouldn't it be much better, ladies and gentlemen, if we were to focus the might of this great nation against our real enemies rather than bothering with these miscreants on the rim? Tell me you couldn't picture it. I'm going to talk about slanting later. That's my big topic I'm building up to. But one of the things I want to point out, the episode keeps slanting the VOD War as if they're bad guys. The mere fact that I say that probably gives away some of my opinion, but I bring it up because I feel like the episode isn't willing to go all the way to make them bad guys. Not really. There's one VOD War who is pretty clearly a jackass. One of all of them. There's even a scene where that one VOD War, who's a jackass, is like, oh, let's kill them all. And then they say, no. Let's put them in the stasis pods. And maybe someone could wake them up in a few centuries, huh? Now, that may sound like sadistic cruelty, but it actually isn't if you really think about it. And I also feel like pointing out that that guy was kind of pushed into his circumstance by Janeway. Let's examine events here. Okay. First of all, did the VOD War lie about their nature? Yes, they are guilty of that. Absolutely. Not even going to argue that. Are the VOD War evil? That's a lot more debatable. I'll be talking about that a little bit more in a bit. But what I really want to talk about is, what did Janeway then do? How do I put this? Janeway laid down the Starfleet gospel and refused to budge from it. That included forcing a race who has, by their perspective, remember, for them it's only been days since the invasion that wiped out their people. So, from their perspective, it's only been days. So, they are forced to basically hand their lives over to these complete strangers and trust in their goodwill to take care of them, when at the same time, those exact same strangers are refusing military aid. Now, do I think Janeway should have given them torpedoes? That's a lot more debatable. But you know what's part of being an alliance? Trading military hardware for mutual defense. That's normal. That's commonplace amongst alliances. Never mind full-out military defense pacts. We're not even getting into that. This is just, we are allied against a common enemy. Janeway then, instead, decides to betray these people to their frickin'... Now, okay, in fairness, she was attacked first. And yet the really screwed up thing, and this is what gets to me. So, this is why I say this is such a weird episode to talk about. Because on the one hand, I could just rant at Janeway for basically pushing the VOD War leader. I don't even think he was given a name in this episode. The VOD War dude, evil guy, into action, into trying to take Voyager. So, definitely, in my opinion, Janeway's fault. And yet, the interesting thing is, when she discovers the truth, she insults them, and yet she still says she's going ahead with the alliance. Now, that's interesting to me. From the VOD War perspective, I could see them not believing her. I could see them still being mistrustful. I could still see them going forward with their plan to just take Voyager. I could perceive that. However, it is an interesting point of note to counterbalance the earlier point that Janeway is like, you have violated my trust. However, we are still willing to help you. We're just going to be more cautious about it rather than opening our arms to you. Which, in my opinion, is the right call. Legitimately. Why does my phone keep going off? I do think that legitimately. I think that keeping the alliance going just more cautiously is absolutely accurate. Never mind the Voyager's own needs to get the hell off the planet and get away from the Terai. That's a duh. But it also makes sense from a purely tactical standpoint, a purely alliance standpoint, and frankly from a moral standpoint. We did say we'd help you. You didn't actually hurt us. You haven't actually done anything against us yet, but you did lie to us. So we're going to keep helping you, just a little more cautiously now. That is one of the most surprisingly sense-making decisions I've seen her make in a long time. Now, I also find it interesting, the overall VOD War perspective. I would really love to analyze more of the VOD War culture. We see a fair amount of it throughout this episode. And again, you get that feeling, again, Joe Manosky doing what he does best, character stuff. You get that feeling that the VOD War were intended to be another full-fleshed species, rather than kind of like the Voth were, rather than just being bad guys of the week. We get little bits and pieces, insights, just little windows into their culture. That he's got that wonderful speech where he talks about, if it's raining, do you run from doorway to doorway getting rained on all the while, or do you just accept that it's raining? I think that one sentence says a huge amount about VOD War culture, about accepting the realities of what they are presented with, about severe pragmatism. I was reminded a bit of the Cardassians, but when I started actually analyzing that, the more I thought about that, the more I feel the VOD War and the Cardassians are actually more separate than I was thinking. Cardassians are a whole other thing. I'm going to talk about them probably a lot, actually, when we go through Deep Space Nine. The VOD War seem, if anything, very cold-blooded, I think is the word I'd use. Now, usually we associate that term with, I am evil and cold and unfeeling. What I actually mean by that is they are the temperature of whatever happens to be around them. They cannot warm themselves. That's what cold-blooded literally means, right? They are so naturally adaptive that in the worst circumstance, or the best, they are analogous to that circumstance. Make sense? I really want to talk about that. Let's save off. There's another great line. I didn't write it down word for word, where he mentions how when we are children, we teach our children as they go to bed to imagine a different death each night. There's actually some elements of human philosophy in that concept. Slightly, because there's a particular human philosophy, which I can't think of the name of. I'm struggling to think of it right now, where you sit here and you imagine yourself at your absolute happiest, like your peak point of happiness and joy. Just get it crystallized in your mind, and then imagine yourself dead, a rotting corpse, the worms moving through your body, all that thing, trying to balance yourself out, trying to accept things, that kind of a thing. That sort of acceptance mentality does seem to permeate the VOD War, which I find fascinating, since the VOD War leader guy, evil dude, is the only one not ascribing to that philosophy. Gedrin shows that philosophy clearly in all his actions. But evil guy is like, no, I will not accept, and I will not. And he constantly pushes up against the river, if you will. It makes me wonder if people like him are one of the reasons why the VOD War, shall we say, overstepped their bounds 900 years ago. Because that many species uniting against them, that doesn't happen overnight. And that doesn't happen without cause. Makes me wonder what they were doing with that. Let's move on. I want to give huge props really quick. I just have a note here to the CGI team. They do some really good stuff with the destroyed city and the Voyager sitting amongst it, and the underspace itself. Really good stuff. The underspace is actually kind of a recycled graphic. I bet you didn't even know that, though, looking at it, which is my point. They did a really, really good job of that. I like the Naomi scenes, and I like Neelix's scenes, where Neelix just kind of slowly and quietly pieces things together, because it makes a fairly large amount of sense to me that if you have a very singularly common thread amongst multiple fables and stories from history, there's probably at least a reason for that. Now, that reason may or may not be historically real-life relevant, but if you analyze real-life stories and tales and everything, you can see some common threads which do have some real-life prevalence. I don't want to get into this because this is a gargantuan topic, but ask someone sometime about how World War II completely changed the way we view fiction. Across the whole planet, the whole species started looking at fiction differently after World War II. I'm serious. Look into it sometime. It's a fascinating topic. So it's not that out of bounds that when such a common thread is found that there's some reality to it. And I like that he immediately went to Seven and said, can you corroborate my findings? Rather than rushed off to Janeway and said, Captain, I found something, blah, blah. He was actually quite smart in this episode. Which I feel like pointing out because... I don't know why. Because I do. And then Voyager gets its ass kicked. I have a note here. Full circle. Full circle. Voyager is taking off and they get their ass kicked again by people that they have spent the entire episode They have spent the entire episode constantly talking about how the VOD War have out-of-date technology and out-of-date weapons, and they really need Voyager's weapons, and they really need Voyager. And yet, despite that, they somehow beat the ever-living snot out of Voyager. I get the feeling that Voyager has, like, inverse plot shields. Like, they get their ass kicked so that the plot can happen, as opposed to most characters who have plot shields that save them from things that should have killed them. I do want to say one thing before I get to my big two topics. I like the solution to their problem. They're pretty much out of power, and they can't get their impulse drives going. Okay, so the power is the problem. And they say, can we use the radioactive junk in the atmosphere as a power source? Now, that actually makes sense. You know, there's no technobabble involved in it. That is radioactive material, and therefore stuff that can be used as an extremely crude form of fuel with it. Harry then brings up the logical reaction to that. We would have to make some kind of process to make that actually a usable fuel source, process it correctly, rather than just dumping it in the engine core. We are not a gas tank after all. Okay, still with it. Then they say, why don't we just collect it directly and use it directly as a power source? Okay, that's just a little bit questionable until they bring up the problem with it, which is that's going to blow out the hell out of our power relays because we haven't had time to process it, like we just said. All of that is I point this out because this is such a rare example of a non-technobabble answer to a problem. In Voyager in specific. TNG used to do non-technobabble stuff fairly frequently, actually. So did some of the other Star Treks. But Voyager usually leans pretty heavy on the technobabble button. So it actually struck me that this was one of the rare exceptions where that was not true. And then Seven learns a lesson about humanity. Oh, wait, I should do the Terminator thing. Da-na-na, da-na-na. So, let's talk about the two big things I wanted to talk about. First I want to talk about is the fact that I just bent my notes. The underspace. First of all, I find the underspace fascinating. It is such a Brennan Braga thing. It is such an interesting concept that I really wish they did more with. First of all, they mentioned that it's natural, but I would take that information with a grain of salt, because the idea that there are just subspace corridors that stretch across thousands of light years that naturally occur is, and given the fact that these corridors will naturally break down and have disruptions and issues if not maintained, to me that says those are a construct. Those are something that were made not by the VOD War, or at least probably not by the VOD War. The VOD War themselves freely admit we found them, we mapped them, we learned how to maintain them, but we didn't actually build them. So either the ancient VOD War built them and they forgot, possible, or someone else built them and they forgot, or they are gone, or they're destroyed. And I just find that to be such a, it's such a quest hook as a lore person to me. You know, I want to know more. Yes, tell me more. It's especially important because it says everything you need to know about how the VOD War approached other species. Let me talk to you a little bit about projected power, okay? Force projection is actually what it's usually called. Projected power, the modern example is aircraft carriers, but the most common example that most people can understand simply and easily is a castle. In actual medieval times, when castles really started coming up, it was projected power incarnate, because here's how this works. There's a huge chunk of land, okay? Now, all these people may have their own little armies, or peasants, or skirmishers, or militia, or whatever it is they happen to have at their disposal, right? But you walk in, you make a castle here, okay? Now, this castle is very, very hard. This is before siege weaponry really became a thing, okay? This is when castles were on the rise, when the castles swept across Europe, okay? And other places. So, I know Europe's history at this point of time better. That's why I'm specifically using Europe as an example. Forgive me. So, you drop a castle down here. Obviously, it's not a small expense, but you do it. And then you basically own all the land around there. What I mean by that is no one can stop you from owning the land around you. You send your knights out, you send your troops out, they collect tithes, they collect taxes, they take. In every way that matters, that is your territory, your land. You may not have a piece of paper that says it's yours. You may not have troops emplaced in the nearby towns ensuring that it's yours. You may not even be defending it from external forces. But in every way that matters, that is your land, because you can take from it at will. And anytime anyone tries to stop you, you go back to the castle, which is an extremely defensible resource. And most of the people around here are probably not going to be capable of taking your castle. Projected power is what that is, or a force projection if you prefer. I prefer to call it projected power, because force projection is more about distribution of supplies and resources, whereas projected power is a little bit more about the actual military utilization thereof. But moving along, point being, that's exactly what the underspace is. It's a castle. And I have to give huge props to whoever actually originally came up with this idea. I keep attributing it to Braga, but I don't know that for certainty. Huge props to whoever came up with the idea, because they have actually invented a castle in space. They have actually invented that concept in a sci-fi space environment. And I don't know if you understand how difficult that is to actually do, due to the nature of faster-than-light travel and the three-dimensional massive space aspect of space. It's difficult to make that kind of a concept even work in a science fiction setting. And yet they did it here. So huge, huge props to that idea. There's so much more that they could have done with it, too. The idea of being able to strike, take, and then leave. There's a reason they keep being described in these Talaxian tales as raiders, as people who show up, take, and leave. They keep talking about how they expanded their territory. Yet I would bet you money that other than a few colonies at specific junctions along the network, they didn't actually own, they weren't squatting on that much territory. They didn't have that many planets which had VOD War on them. What they had was projected power. The ability to reach out to just about anywhere within a huge distance and take as if it was theirs. And this goes back to my earlier point. How hard did the VOD War have to push? How greedy did they get in order to be able to push so many races across such a huge variety of area in order to be able to pull them back down and defeat them? I'm very curious about that. Also, yes, I know the VOD War on STO. I haven't gotten there yet in the quests, though, so I can't comment on that. Sorry, guys. Last thing I wanted to talk about is slanted storytelling. So I've kind of been leading up to this point. Ugh, the whole rumination so far. This is a long episode. I have a lot to talk about today. I feel bad every time I have a Babylon 5 episode that's tiny and then I have a Voyager episode that's huge. I just have more to talk about over here, I guess. Slanted storytelling is when you want something to be perceived in a certain way, but you may or may not be a good enough writer to write that in, so you use tricks to make it happen. Now, this is not necessarily bad storytelling. There is some good audio and good visual design in this episode. It is a good presentation of a somewhat lackluster idea. To explain what I mean by this, looking at it from purely an analytical point, removing morality from the situation for a moment, removing emotion from it for a certain moment, the whole situation with the VOD War seems actually quite neutral. There's the one obviously evil guy, I've talked about him a few times, bad guy dude. And then the rest of the VOD War actually would come across as fairly understandable, fairly neutral, fairly logical beings. And I kind of get the where they're coming from and why they're doing what they're doing and blah, 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 blah. I don't view them as bad guys of the week because from a purely logical perspective, they aren't. And yet, watch this episode again. Again, I know you probably aren't. But if you've watched this episode again, listen to the music. Listen to the angles. Listen, the very camera literally uses, I'm terrible with my words. They use cinematographic, is that a word? Tricks of cinematography in order to show the VOD War as if they're the bad guys. They do this constantly. They even do this in the intro, when they're shown as two people who are trying to get into a stasis cell to survive. And yet the episode does this constantly. This is something I've talked about many, many times, that presentation is eminently important when it comes to entertainment, that you need to be able to present your information. You could have a great entertainer presenting incredibly boring facts, and it will be entertaining. You can have something incredibly interesting being presented by someone incredibly boring, and it will be very boring. Presentation value matters. And slanted presentation is when you're deliberately trying to make your audience think something. Now, I do say that is good, But at the same time, I have to admit, I am a little bit of a victim of pendulum effect when I see slanted storytelling. Like in this episode, for example, I kept finding myself pushing further away from the VOD War, the bad guys, because the episode kept saying, no, they're evil! They're evil! You don't get it! They're so evil! God, why don't you understand? And I'm like, no, hang on. Let's actually think about this for a second. But I don't know, I enjoy this episode more than I should because of its presentation. It's got good directing, very good directing job, and some good character moments, like I said. Hang on, I feel like I'm missing one point. Let me check my notes really quick. There's one other thing that they do with slanted storytelling. I just want to give a comparison of slanted storytelling to give you an idea what I'm talking about. And then I'll cut it off. Any of you out there play Assassin's Creed 3? If you haven't, I just realized I can't talk about it without spoiling. So I'm just going to say there's something in Assassin's Creed 3 which is a great example of slanted storytelling, and why I'm not necessarily against slanted storytelling, where you're obviously supposed to think this, and everything visually and audially and everything they're doing is all making you think this, and then it's actually this. And it's like, ugh, and it's a great impact. But Voyager doesn't do that. Voyager is like, here's the VOD War, they're evil, they're evil, they're evil, they're evil. This one goes okay, but they're evil, they're evil. They even treat the fact that some of the VOD Wars survive genocide as a bad thing in this episode. No, think about it, seriously. That's all the VOD War that are left that we're aware of, right? Not one planet. And they've got their ships there. There's the Terai ships. And then Voyager leaves, suddenly having warp power back, despite the fact that they were having trouble going to Impulse earlier. Not even going into that. And then we have some bad news. Some of the VOD War survived. That's not how they say it, but it is what they mean. Anyways, hope you've enjoyed the episode. Next week we have another bipolar episode. We'll get to it. I'll see you next time, guys.